28th of October, 1940. The telegram arrived at Hitler's mountain retreat while he was still seething from an unexpected affront. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce of fascist Italy, had just invaded Greece without consulting his Axis partner. The German Führer's rage echoed through the halls of the Berghof as aides scrambled to assess the implications. What began as Mussolini's vanity project would spiral into a catastrophic Mediterranean campaign that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives and alter the course of the Second World War. The azure waters of the Mediterranean, once symbols of ancient civilizations and peaceful commerce, were about to become a vast graveyard. Mussolini's hubris knew no bounds that autumn. He had watched with growing envy as Hitler's Wehrmacht carved through Europe with mechanical precision. The Italian dictator craved his own military triumph, his own conquest to parade before the Italian people. Greece, he believed, would fall within weeks. Standing on his balcony in Rome, Mussolini declared to his generals that history would remember this moment as the beginning of a new Roman Empire. The Greek campaign, he assured them, would be a mere walkover. His words would return to haunt him within months. The Greek mountains had other plans. By mid-November, the Italian invasion had stalled completely. Greek forces, fighting for their homeland with desperate courage, pushed the Italians back into Albania. Mussolini's soldiers, ill-equipped for mountain warfare and poorly supplied, found themselves retreating in freezing conditions. The Italian army, which had marched into Greece expecting an easy victory, now faced a humiliating defeat. Hitler watched this debacle with mounting concern. His southern flank, which he needed secure for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, was crumbling. 28th of March, 1941. German panzer divisions rolled across the Yugoslav border, beginning Operation Marita. Hitler had decided he could no longer trust Mussolini to secure the Mediterranean. The Wehrmacht, battle-hardened from campaigns in Poland and France, swept through Yugoslavia and Greece with terrifying efficiency. British forces, dispatched to help the Greeks, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. Within weeks, the swastika flew over Athens. But this was merely the prelude to the real disaster. The strategic situation demanded a decision. Crete, the large Greek island in the southern Mediterranean, housed British forces and provided a potential launching point for air attacks on Romanian oil fields that fueled the German war machine. General Kurt Student, commander of the Luftwaffe's airborne forces, proposed an audacious plan. The first major airborne invasion in military history. Operation Mercury would see thousands of German paratroopers dropped onto Crete to seize the island. Hitler, still frustrated by the delays caused by the Balkan campaign, approved the operation. The British defenders on Crete, commanded by Major General Bernard Freyberg, knew the Germans were coming. Intelligence intercepts had revealed the invasion plans. Freyberg positioned his troops, including New Zealand, Australian, and Greek forces, around the key airfields. The stage was set for one of the war's bloodiest battles. As May 1941 approached, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would test the limits of human endurance. The Mediterranean was about to earn its gruesome nickname, the meat grinder. 20th of May, 1941. Dawn broke over Crete with deceptive tranquility. The Mediterranean stretched endless and blue, but the skies above soon filled with an ominous droning. German bombers appeared first, waves of them, darkening the sky like locusts. They pounded the island's defenses with systematic brutality, turning defensive positions into cratered moonscapes. Then came the transport aircraft, hundreds of Junkers Ju-52 trimotor planes, their engines creating a mechanical thunder that announced the arrival of hell itself. Major General Bernard Freyberg stood in his command post near Canea, watching through binoculars as the first paratroopers began falling from the sky. They descended like strange flowers, their parachutes blooming white and colored against the brilliant blue Mediterranean sky. According to military records preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, Freyberg initially believed his defenders held every advantage. The British had broken German codes and knew the invasion plan intimately. His troops waited in concealed positions, weapons trained on the landing zones. What followed would become one of the war's most savage close-quarters battles. The first German paratroopers landed directly into a storm of fire. New Zealand and Australian soldiers, hidden in olive groves and behind stone walls, opened up with everything they had. Machine guns chattered, rifles cracked, and the paratroopers died by the hundreds before they could even cut themselves free from their harnesses. The sky filled with falling bodies, some still attached to their parachutes, others plummeting like stones. The German plan had called for the paratroopers to land, secure their weapons containers, and quickly overwhelm the defenders. Instead, they found themselves fighting for survival the moment they touched ground. General Student watched from the Greek mainland as reports filtered back of catastrophic casualties. His elite Fallschirmjäger units, the pride of the Luftwaffe, were being slaughtered. At Maleme airfield, the battle reached its crescendo. The airfield was the key to the entire operation. If the Germans could secure it, they could land transport planes with reinforcements and heavy weapons. If they failed, Operation Mercury would become Germany's first major defeat in the war. Throughout that first terrible day, the outcome hung in the balance. 21st of May brought no respite. The Germans had managed to establish a precarious foothold near Maleme, but at horrific cost. Bodies littered the airfield and surrounding hills. Wounded men cried out in the olive groves, their voices carrying across the battlefield in the hot Mediterranean sun. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but they faced a critical problem. Freiberg had insufficient communications equipment. He couldn't maintain contact with all his units, couldn't coordinate effectively, couldn't understand the full picture of the battle unfolding across the island. The New Zealand battalion defending Maleme faced an impossible decision. Under constant German pressure, low on ammunition, and uncertain of reinforcements, they began withdrawing from the heights overlooking the airfield. It was a tactical retreat meant to be temporary, but it proved decisive. The Germans seized the opportunity. Despite the runway being under direct artillery fire, Luftwaffe pilots began landing Ju-52s on Maleme. Many crashed, destroyed by British shells. Others landed successfully, disgorging mountain troops and supplies. The transport planes that made it out again left behind their precious cargo. Those that didn't became wreckage lining the runway. The meat grinder had claimed its first thousands. German casualties were staggering, higher than any previous operation. But they had their foothold. As night fell on the 21st, both sides prepared for the grinding battle that would consume the coming days. 22nd of May, 1941. The battle for Crete entered its third day with the smell of death hanging heavy over the island. At Maleme airfield, German transport planes continued their desperate landings. The Luftwaffe was feeding men into the meat grinder at an unsustainable rate. Pilots approached through clouds of smoke and explosions, their aircraft riddled with bullets before they even touched down. Some planes crashed nose first into the runway, bursting into flames. Others made it just long enough for their passengers to scramble out before British artillery found them. Yet the Germans kept coming. General Freiberg faced a nightmare scenario developing on multiple fronts. While Maleme hung in the balance, German paratroopers had established smaller positions around Rethymno and Heraklion. His forces were spread thin across the island, and he lacked the reserves to mount a decisive counterattack anywhere. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly as Commonwealth soldiers fought in positions they had held for days without relief. Water supplies ran dangerously low. Ammunition dwindled. The wounded accumulated in field hospitals that had no supplies to treat them properly. The German command made a brutal calculation. Despite losses approaching 50% of their airborne forces, they committed everything to Maleme. General Student, horrified by the casualties but recognizing the strategic necessity, ordered his remaining paratroopers and mountain troops to concentrate there. Throughout the 22nd and 23rd, the airlift continued. Dead Germans were pulled from crashed aircraft and stacked like cordwood to clear the runway for the next landing. The living stepped over the dead to reach their positions. It was warfare reduced to its most primitive mathematics. Whoever could feed more men into the grinder faster would win. 24th of May brought a critical British decision. The Royal Navy had been attempting to intercept German sea convoys bringing reinforcements and supplies. In the narrow waters north of Crete, British destroyers and cruisers had found and destroyed several convoys, sending hundreds more Germans to the bottom of the Mediterranean. But the Luftwaffe controlled the skies, and British ships paid a terrible price. The destroyer Juno was sunk. The cruiser Gloucester went down with heavy casualties. The cruiser Fiji followed. The battleship Warspite limped away severely damaged. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean fleet, faced an agonizing choice. His ships were being hammered by German dive bombers. Every hour his vessels remained in Cretan waters, they faced potential annihilation from above. Yet withdrawing would leave the island's defenders without naval support and make eventual evacuation far more difficult. In his memoirs, later examined by historians at the National Archives, Cunningham wrote of this moment, "It takes 3 years to build a ship, but 300 years to build a tradition." He would keep his fleet in the fight despite the cost, but on land, the situation had become untenable. The Germans now had thousands of troops ashore at Malem. They had artillery, they had supplies, and they had momentum. Freiburg's defensive positions were crumbling under sustained assault. The Commonwealth forces, who had fought brilliantly against overwhelming odds, were exhausted. Communications remained sporadic. Several units found themselves cut off, unaware that their flanks had collapsed or that friendly forces had withdrawn. By the evening of the 26th, the grim reality crystallized. Crete could not be held. The order came to begin withdrawing toward the southern coast, where the Royal Navy would attempt an evacuation. The meat grinders' jaws were closing, and thousands of men would have to run a gauntlet to escape. 27th of May, 1941. The retreat across Crete became an odyssey of suffering that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Thousands of Commonwealth soldiers began trekking south toward the coastal village of Sfakia, where the Royal Navy would attempt to evacuate them. The route led through the White Mountains, a harsh landscape of limestone peaks and narrow gorges. Under normal circumstances, the journey was challenging. With the German army in pursuit and the Luftwaffe hunting from above, it became a desperate race for survival. The men moved in columns that stretched for miles, winding through mountain passes like exhausted serpents. They carried wounded comrades on improvised stretchers. They abandoned equipment to move faster. Many had gone days without proper food or water. The Mediterranean sun turned the mountain paths into furnaces during the day, while nights brought cold that cut through their tattered uniforms. German aircraft strafed the columns whenever they emerged from cover. Men dove behind rocks, flattened themselves in ditches, and watched helplessly as bullets tore through their ranks. Rearguard actions fought by Australian and New Zealand battalions bought precious time for the evacuation. These soldiers knew they might not make it out themselves. They set ambushes in the mountain passes, held positions until they were nearly overrun, then fell back and did it again. Their sacrifice allowed thousands to reach Sfakia. The village itself offered little shelter. It was merely a small cluster of buildings perched above a tiny harbor. As troops arrived, they found crowds already assembled on the beaches, waiting anxiously for ships that might never come. Admiral Cunningham had committed to the evacuation despite knowing the cost would be severe. His ships would have to approach Crete under cover of darkness, embark as many men as possible, and then race back to Egypt before dawn exposed them to German aircraft. The operation would take multiple nights. Each night thousands would have to be left behind, watching the ships disappear over the horizon and hoping they would return. The night of the 28th to 29th saw the first major evacuation. Destroyers and cruisers crept into Sfakia under a moonless sky. Men waded out to boats, climbed scrambling nets up the sides of warships, and packed themselves into every available space below decks. The Navy, loaded far beyond safe capacity. Ships designed to carry crews of 300 took aboard over 1,000 soldiers. When German aircraft appeared at dawn, the overladen vessels could barely maneuver. The destroyer Hereward was crippled and captured. The cruiser Dido was badly damaged. Each subsequent night repeated this desperate pattern. Ships arrived in darkness, loaded men frantically, and departed before first light. Those left behind watched with sinking hearts, wondering if tonight would be their last chance. German forces were closing in on Sfakia. The defensive perimeter shrank daily. Ammunition ran critically low. On the beaches, discipline began to fray as exhausted, desperate men pushed toward the boats. 31st of May marked the final evacuation. By then, roughly 15,000 men had been pulled off the island, but thousands more remained. General Freiburg himself departed on one of the last ships, a decision that would haunt him despite being ordered to leave. When dawn broke on the 1st of June, Approximately 12,000 Commonwealth soldiers remained on Crete, out of ammunition and options. They surrendered to the advancing Germans, beginning years of captivity in prisoner-of-war camps. 1st of June, 1941. As the last British ships fled south toward Egypt, the full magnitude of the Cretan disaster became apparent. The Mediterranean had indeed proven itself a meat grinder, and both sides had been fed into its bloody mechanism. German paratroopers who had survived the battle wandered through fields littered with their dead comrades, many still hanging from trees where their parachutes had snagged. The elite Fallschirmjäger units had been gutted. Of the approximately 15,000 German airborne troops committed to Operation Mercury, over 6,000 were dead, wounded, or missing. General Kurt Student stood among the olive groves near Malem and surveyed what victory had cost. The casualty rate was unprecedented for a successful German operation. Entire companies had been wiped out in the first hours of the battle. The cream of Germany's airborne forces lay buried in Cretan soil. Hitler, upon learning the true cost, reportedly declared there would be no more large-scale airborne operations. The Fallschirmjäger, once considered the Wehrmacht's elite shock troops, would spend the rest of the war fighting as conventional infantry. Crete had broken them as a strategic force. Commonwealth losses told an equally grim story. Over 3,500 British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek soldiers had died defending the island. Another 12,000 were captured, facing years of imprisonment. The Royal Navy's losses were staggering. According to documentation preserved by the Naval Historical Branch in Britain, the Mediterranean fleet had lost 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers sunk, with 17 other vessels damaged, some beyond repair. Over 2,000 Royal Navy sailors had gone down with their ships. For an empire already stretched thin across multiple theaters, these losses were catastrophic. The strategic implications rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Hitler's planned invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had been delayed by weeks while German forces dealt with the Balkan campaign in Crete. Those weeks, historians would later argue, proved crucial. The Wehrmacht would reach the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941, only to be stopped by the onset of the brutal Russian winter. Perhaps, some military analysts suggested, those lost weeks made the difference between capturing Moscow and being halted at its gates. For Winston Churchill, sitting in the underground cabinet war rooms in London, Crete represented another blow in a series of disasters. Britain had been forced from the European continent at Dunkirk. The North African campaign swung back and forth. Now an island defended by tens of thousands of Commonwealth troops had fallen, despite advance knowledge of German plans. The Prime Minister paced his underground sanctum, cigar clenched between his teeth, contemplating the grinding reality of total war. Britain was hanging on, but barely. The Mediterranean itself had been transformed into a contested battleground. The German presence in Crete meant that British convoys to Egypt now faced aerial attack throughout their voyage. Malta, the small island fortress that controlled the central Mediterranean, came under intensified bombardment. The entire theater had become an arena of attrition, where ships, aircraft, and men were consumed in a remorseless grinding of materiel and morale. Yet within the disaster lay seeds of future Allied success. The Germans had demonstrated the limitations of airborne assault against prepared defenses. The defenders, though ultimately defeated, had shown that determined troops with adequate support could inflict catastrophic casualties even when facing Germany's supposedly invincible forces. The lessons learned in the mountains and olive groves of Crete would inform Allied planning for the rest of the war. The Mediterranean meat grinder had taught both sides brutal truths about modern warfare's realities. 10th of June, 1941. While the world's attention remained fixed on Crete, another disaster was unfolding across the broader Mediterranean theater. Operation Battle Axe, the British attempt to relieve the besieged fortress of Tobruk in Libya, collapsed after 3 days of fierce fighting. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the German Afrika Korps, had demonstrated once again his tactical brilliance by destroying nearly half of Britain's available tanks in North Africa. The meat grinder was operating on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Mediterranean had become a theater of cascading failures for the British Empire. Every convoy attempting to resupply Malta ran a gauntlet of Italian and German aircraft based on Sicily, and now Crete. Merchant ships carrying desperately needed supplies to the island fortress were sunk in growing numbers. The submarine base at Malta, which had been harassing Axis supply lines to North Africa, came under such heavy bombardment that operations were severely curtailed. The strategic situation was deteriorating faster than London could respond. In North Africa, the seesaw nature of desert warfare continued its grinding rhythm. Towns changed hands multiple times. Tobruk, held by a predominantly Australian garrison, remained under siege. The defenders, living in underground bunkers carved into the limestone, endured constant shelling and bombing. Supply ships attempting to reach the port ran a deadly gauntlet. Many were sunk within sight of safety. The survivors would describe the harbor filled with wrecked vessels, their masts protruding from the water like crosses marking graves. 21st of June brought news that dwarfed even the Mediterranean disasters. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest military operation in history. The delays caused by the Balkan and Cretan campaigns meant this invasion started later than originally planned. Some German generals privately worried about completing the operation before winter, but the initial advances were spectacular. Soviet forces reeled backward under the onslaught. The opening of the Eastern Front paradoxically provided some relief in the Mediterranean. German attention and resources shifted eastward toward the battle for survival developing in Russia. Some Luftwaffe units were withdrawn from the Mediterranean theater and sent to support Barbarossa. This easing of pressure allowed the Royal Navy to operate with slightly less risk, though the sea lanes remained deadly. Malta received supplies through convoys that fought every mile of their passage. Ships arrived in harbor burning, listing, barely afloat, but they arrived. August and September. 1941 saw the grinding continue in North Africa. The desert became a crematorium under the summer sun. Tank battles erupted and died away, leaving blackened steel hulks scattered across the sand. Infantry assaults bogged down in minefields. Both sides struggled with supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Rommel's Africa Corps needed fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements ferried across the Mediterranean. British forces depended on supplies shipped around Africa or through the deadly Mediterranean route. Whoever could keep their forces supplied would win this war of attrition. The human cost mounted in ways that statistics could barely capture. Field hospitals on both sides overflowed with wounded. Men died of infected wounds because medical supplies couldn't reach frontline units. Tank crews burned to death in their vehicles. Pilots crashed into the sea and were never found. Sailors drowned in burning oil. The Mediterranean sun, which had once beckoned tourists to ancient ruins and picturesque beaches, now beat down on battlefields that produced nothing but corpses and wreckage. The meat grinder operated ceaselessly, consuming young men from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Italy, and eventually soldiers from nations across the globe. The disaster that had begun with Mussolini's vanity invasion of Greece had metastasized into a theater-wide catastrophe with no end in sight. 20th of March, 1942. The bombing of Malta reached a new intensity that would make the island the most heavily bombed place on Earth during the Second World War. German and Italian aircraft launched up to 15 raids per day. The island's defenders counted over 3,000 alerts in the first 4 months of the year. Buildings collapsed into rubble. The ancient streets of Valletta, once magnificent examples of Renaissance architecture, became mazes of destruction. Citizens lived underground in catacombs and tunnels carved centuries earlier. The strategic importance of Malta could not be overstated. From this tiny island, British submarines and aircraft had been savaging Axis supply convoys to North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps was often operating on minimal supplies because ships carrying fuel and ammunition never reached Libyan ports. Hitler and Mussolini decided Malta had to be neutralized. Operation Hercules, a planned invasion similar to Crete, was prepared. But the memory of Crete's casualties haunted German planning. The invasion was repeatedly postponed while the Luftwaffe attempted to bomb the island into submission. Flight Lieutenant George Burling, a Canadian pilot defending Malta, described the sky above the island as a vertical battlefield where death came from every angle. The handful of Hurricane and Spitfire fighters based on Malta faced odds of 10 to 1 on good days, worse on bad ones. Pilots flew multiple missions per day until exhaustion claimed more lives than enemy action. Ground crews worked miracles keeping damaged aircraft flying, cannibalizing wrecks to keep a few fighters operational. The meat grinder consumed aircraft as readily as it consumed men. By April, Malta's situation had become desperate. Food supplies dwindled. Fuel reserves dropped to critical levels. The submarine base ceased operations entirely. The island's offensive capability, which had been so valuable in disrupting Axis supplies, evaporated. If Malta fell or was completely neutralized, Rommel would receive unlimited supplies for a renewed offensive in Egypt. The British understood this with terrible clarity. Malta had to hold, regardless of cost. But holding required supplies that couldn't reach the island. Operation Pedestal, launched in August 1942, represented Britain's all-or-nothing effort to save Malta. A massive convoy of 14 merchant ships departed Gibraltar, protected by the strongest naval escort ever assembled for a Mediterranean operation. Aircraft carrier Victorious, battleships Nelson and Rodney, dozens of cruisers and destroyers formed a protective shield around the merchantmen. Historians at the National Maritime Museum have documented this convoy as one of the most desperate naval operations of the entire war. The Axis forces threw everything at Pedestal. Submarines torpedoed the aircraft carrier Eagle, which sank in minutes. Coordinated air attacks came in waves. The Italian Navy deployed submarines, torpedo boats, and eventually surface ships. One by one, the merchant ships were hit. The tanker Ohio, carrying vital fuel oil, was struck repeatedly, but kept going. Her crew refused to abandon ship even as the vessel broke apart beneath them. Destroyer crews watched in horror as merchant seamen died in burning oil slicks, their ships going down loaded with the supplies Malta desperately needed. By the time remnants of the convoy limped into Malta's Grand Harbor on 15th of August, only 5 merchant ships survived out of the original 14. The Navy had lost the aircraft carrier Eagle, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer sunk, with many more vessels damaged. But those 5 ships, especially the shattered, barely floating Ohio towed between 2 destroyers, carried enough supplies to keep Malta alive. Church bells rang across the island as the damaged ships entered harbor. Citizens emerged from their underground shelters to cheer. The meat grinder had been denied another complete victory, though the cost had been devastating. 3rd of November, 1942. In the western desert of Egypt, near a small railway stop called El Alamein, the Mediterranean meat grinder finally began turning against the Axis. General Bernard Montgomery, now commanding the British 8th Army, launched Operation Lightfoot with crushing artillery bombardments that lit up the night sky. Rommel's Africa Corps, starved of supplies by Malta's resurgent submarines and aircraft, faced an opponent who finally possessed overwhelming material superiority. The turning point had arrived. The Battle of El Alamein ground forward with methodical brutality. Montgomery, learning from past disasters, refused to be drawn into the mobile tank battles where Rommel excelled. Instead, he employed set-piece attacks supported by massive artillery concentrations. The grinding nature of the battle reflected everything the Mediterranean campaign had become. Attritional warfare, where victory went to whoever could sustain losses longer. By 13th of November, Rommel was retreating westward, his army shattered. The myth of German invincibility in North Africa died in the minefields of El Alamein. 8 days earlier, on 8th of November, Operation Torch had landed American and British forces in Morocco and Algeria. The United States, now fully committed to the war after Pearl Harbor, brought fresh troops and vast material resources to the Mediterranean theater. The Axis forces in North Africa were being ground between 2 advancing armies. The meat grinder's mechanism was reversing. Now German and Italian soldiers faced encirclement, supply, shortages, and eventual defeat. The strategic implications cascaded rapidly. Hitler, refusing to abandon North Africa despite military logic, poured reinforcements into Tunisia. Fresh German divisions were flown and shipped across the Mediterranean, feeding more men into a theater that had become indefensible. Allied air and naval forces, operating from Malta and North African bases, savaged these supply convoys. Ships went down loaded with troops, tanks and supplies that Germany desperately needed on the Eastern Front. The Mediterranean meat grinder consumed entire Axis armies that could have influenced battles elsewhere. 13th of May, 1943. The last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered near Cape Bon in Tunisia. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity. It was a defeat comparable to Stalingrad, which had concluded just 3 months earlier. The campaign that began with Mussolini's invasion of Greece in October 1940 had finally reached its conclusion. The Mediterranean was now firmly in Allied control. The grinding battle had claimed hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, sunk countless ships, and consumed resources that might have altered outcomes elsewhere. The lessons of the Mediterranean campaign would shape Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. The disaster at Crete taught the limits of airborne operations. The defense of Malta demonstrated the strategic value of unsinkable aircraft carriers. The North African campaign proved that in modern industrial warfare, logistics and supply often mattered more than tactical brilliance. The grinding, attritional nature of the fighting foreshadowed what awaited in Italy, France, and ultimately Germany itself. As peace eventually came to the Mediterranean, the region bore scars that would take decades to heal. Crete's villages remained pockmarked with bullet holes. Sunken ships lay on the seabed from Gibraltar to Alexandria. The cemeteries stretched across North Africa, marking where young men from a dozen nations had fallen. The meat grinder had finally stopped, but its human cost defied calculation. The Mediterranean campaign stands as one of World War II's most disastrous theaters, not because of a single catastrophic battle, but because of its cumulative grinding destruction. It consumed armies, fleets, and air forces in a years-long attritional struggle that neither side could afford, but neither could abandon. From Mussolini's disastrous Greek adventure to the final surrender in Tunisia, the Mediterranean served as a strategic sinkhole that swallowed resources, ruined reputations, and demonstrated that in total war, even victories could prove Pyrrhic. The azure waters that had witnessed the rise of Western civilization became a graveyard for the ambitions of modern empires, earning forever the grim sobriquet, the meat grinder.